All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, August 25th of 2021. Thank you for tuning into the stream here today. Whether you're watching me live or listening or watching this back as a recording, I appreciate you being here. If this is your first time watching the stream, I know we're getting a bunch of new viewers here now every single day. I think there's a lot of excitement with football coming up, so it's been awesome to see us get some more viewers recently. But if this is your first time, this is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from SaberSim users about DFS, about SaberSim, about how to get the most out of the product. So I host the show live for a reason. I take questions that we get in through YouTube chat and through our Office Hours channel on Slack and answer them live here, and want follow-up questions and clarifying questions from you guys. And I want engagement from you guys too. So if we're talking about something and you're a little confused or lost, or just have something that you want to add to the conversation, please do. That's the reason we do these live here. We've got a few questions here today already in the queue. I know we had a long stream yesterday, and there were some questions that had come in the Slack channel right at the end of the show yesterday that I missed, unfortunately, but I'm going to tackle those first here today. Before we go ahead and just jump right in, I will say we are planning on doing a strategy session here tomorrow with everything kind of going on, NFL right around the corner, the redesign going on. Do a little bit of kind of a intermediary strategy session tomorrow, but just wanted to talk about the value of SaberSim as MLB is beginning to kind of think about winding down here, NFL right around the corner. We just wanted to kind of do a quick strategy session, reminding people across all sports just what the advantage is here of using SaberSim, some of the cool interrelationship between some of the sliders and some of the things going on behind the scenes that maybe people aren't always familiar with. So we'll hash that out a little bit more over the next 24 hours here, but we are planning on having a couple other folks from the SaberSim team join me here tomorrow and do a little strategy session for you guys. So I mentioned the beta before we move much further. We are planning on pushing out a full visual update to the app here in the next couple weeks, hopefully before the start of football season. We are doing a beta to existing SaberSim users, or a beta for existing SaberSim users, maybe not two, that we are welcoming any and all feedback. So if you want to try out the beta, it's beta.sabersim.com. You can log in with your existing SaberSim credentials, shoot me a DM in Slack, let me know you're trying it out, and I will add you to a private Slack channel where you can provide any feedback or ask any questions you have. But we're really excited about that. We've been working hard recently on getting that all ready to go. But I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in here. Again, just a quick reminder, always feel free to pop any questions you have for me into the chat channels, and I will get to things as I see them. This question came in from Ron here right at the end of the show yesterday, and it's similar to a question we were talking about yesterday, but he said, in 150 max GPP, do you want exposure to every team on the slate, or can I eliminate a few to keep a core tighter? And this kind of question, again, we do get this often. This question really is, in some ways, it's up to the individual player about your risk versus upside equation. And I talk about that here on stream all the time, right? The tighter your core of players that you're using on any given slate for any given sport, your upside in that contest is likely going to increase, provided that those are good plays, at least. If you have 75% exposure to a certain stack, or even let's just use the example of 100% exposure to one single stack in 150 lineups. If you nail that stack, you have 150 chances really at getting the right pitchers and the right other pieces in that lineup. And when that stack's right, you're probably going to have more opportunities than anybody else in the contest, or at least equal opportunities as anybody else in the contest to come in first, right? That's kind of why that increases your overall upside. It also exposes you to a lot of additional risk, right? If that team, even if that team is the second highest scoring stack or something like that, or there's a team or a way of stacking a team that slightly outperforms that team, but you have 150 lineups with that team, you might just be completely left out to dry, right? Your night could be over pretty quickly. And that's true for pitchers or single players or exposures or anything like that. So in that way, it does depend a little bit on your overall risk portfolio. The one thing I will say about that is we talk a lot about the way that upside, that smart diversity gives you upside in your lineups, right? By making the buckets of random game simulations that we use to determine the projections for each player when we build every single lineup. By making those smaller as smart diversity goes higher, we get more upside games, the impact of single upside games becomes bigger in our sims, and it allows us to use the players' real ranges of outcomes to create upside in our lineups, right? I talk about this a lot, but it is, at least for now, it is smart diversity for a reason. And part of what you get also out of using high smart diversity values is a diverse pool of lineups. And I've mentioned here a bunch that these sliders are back-tested. They're data-driven. They're determined by running probably about tens of thousands of lineups at every single slider setting and determining what slider settings give you the highest expected value lineups for your given contest. And when we get a smart diversity of high here, we are going to get, and I'm going to actually run 150 lineups. You're going to get a pretty diverse pool. There may be players that we're well over the field on. There may be players that are showing up in a majority of our lineups. It may be certain pitchers or things like that the builder really likes that may be showing up in a lot of our lineups. But the builder, in some ways, and these sliders is giving us an indication that this is an appropriate amount of exposure to use for any given player or team on the slate, right? If we have 60% exposure to the best overall pitcher on the slate or something like that, we're getting a bit of a statement from SaberSim as our advisor that when we're looking at a high smart diversity, when we're looking at small buckets of individual game sims to use for our projections, that it makes sense to have that kind of portfolio or exposure to that particular player. So I think if you're unsure of how much exposure to have for a certain player, given your number of lineups, let the default sliders and let the default values for smart diversity guide you. Because again, these are back-tested values. We are attempting to build a portfolio of lineups that we think makes sense for 150 lineups in this particular case. But we'll let this run and we'll talk about this just briefly here for a second. Okay, so our build is done. So yeah, wow, almost nailed it. 60%. That was like the exact example I was using. And that's pretty common. I'm pretty familiar with how these ends up working out. But in a 3 max or a 20 max, you might have 100% Wheeler or 100% Woodruff, right? These are with looking at high smart diversity. These are exposures where we're both over the field or projected to be over the field on both of these guys that we feel like makes sense for this contest. Now, of course, there is nothing wrong with tightening up your pitcher pool. I recommend one of the best ways to do that is to just remove some of these plays that you have at the bottom that are only showing up in a handful of lineups, and it's going to have the effect of tightening up your pool, right? In 150 lineups, you may want to play a little bit of a wider pool than maybe you would in maybe not. So we could even tighten down to like a 4-man pitcher pool, right? And we're just playing a pretty concentrated approach. Again, if some combination of these 4 pitchers is the optimal approach on the slate, we're going to have a great deal of lineups with a wide variety of other stacks to get the other pieces right. And that would be the advantage there. But of course, if other pitchers are the highest scoring pitchers on the night or the pitchers that you need to take down a contest and you have 0 of them, you're going to expose yourself to a lot of risk. You could have a pretty poor night overall. So I think the broad answer to this question is that it really depends on your personal risk versus upside approach. But if you are unsure on how much exposure it makes sense to have to a certain team or player or stack, allow smart diversity for your given contest to help guide you in determining what makes sense for exposure. And you'll see often for hitters, the exposures are quite a bit lower. Hitters have wider ranges of outcomes. They have typically much lower floors. They're not normally distributed. This is all very familiar, and this is all very common for what our builds on a 150 max contest with default sliders is likely to look like. So I know, Ron, this question came in yesterday here, so don't know if you are watching along with me here today. But assuming you... Well, regardless, if you see this and have any follow-up questions for me, just let me know. So, okay, cool. So this was another question. This came in from Swifty here at the end of the stream yesterday. And he said, if I wanted to do 2 separate builds for a 20 max and use 10 entries from each build, for instance, is there a way to do this with the entry editor, or would I have to do this with CSV files and or uploading lineups to DK and then assigning them to contest? Yeah, so this particular case, you are going to have to get your hands dirty in the CSVs a little bit. Right now, the entry editor won't be able to support combining lineups from 2 different builds and entering them into one single contest, not in a way that would be more clunky than just using the CSVs anyway. This is something that has been requested before. I can definitely see the value of this. I know there's some users that kind of tweak projections around and make changes to their builds and things like that, especially trying to attack maybe different ways the slate could play out. Maybe they're running a build where they're taking like a very fade heavy approach. 20% of their lineups, they're fading the chalkiest pitcher, and the other 80% they're using something more like the default build settings or things like that. That all makes sense to me. Down the road, we want to give you guys more control over exactly what's happening with the entry editor. And this is something we have discussed on our end as a possible feature in the future. So right now at the moment, best way to do this is to go back to the good old-fashioned CSVs and make sure your lineups end up in the right contests. So, okay, cool. So, and then one other question came in from Swifty here again right at the end of the show yesterday, and he said, I guess this touches on using the lower tier membership for more than 20 lineups, but I think you're all recommending running the most lineups as possible. So if I have three max contests, I should enter 9 lineups, not the same 3 in each. I presume if I'm on the lower tier, I cannot effectively do this in 20 max contests other than running multiple builds with different sliders or projections. Even if you are on the starter plan, which you're limited to running 20 lineups at a time, you should still be able to do this because 9 lineups is less than 20. Unless I'm totally misreading this question. But yeah, I mean, our approach would be if you're just playing 3 maxes, for example, and that's all you're playing in the slate. I think it makes more sense rather than doubling down on those 3 lineups and playing them in 3 different contests to spread out your risk a little bit. Play 9 different lineups. There's absolutely at least 9 different profitable lineups you can make for this contest and enter them all and play uniquely. And that gives you just more lineups, more shots on goal, right? That's what I was saying yesterday. So your variance is going to be a little bit lower. You're going to have your ability to recognize and realize your expected value in these lineups, assuming they are profitable lineups, is going to be accelerated because you have more lineups. So that's what I would recommend. But yeah, even on the DFS starter plan, you should have no problems. You can go in here and set your sliders to whatever the contest looks like, 3 max. Maybe it's 5,000 people in each contest, and just change this to 9 and go ahead and build your lineup pool. You'll get 9 unique lineups. You can make any adjustments to exposures and things like that as always, and then just enter them uniquely into your contest. Whether you're using the entry editor, you can use the unique fill method, or CSVs, you can just download the entry file and it's real quick and easy. Just export the lineups from the CSV you get from SaberSim and put them into the CSV you get on DraftKings. So should be able to do that no matter what plan you're on here. But good question there. All right, cool. I'm going to go ahead and keep us rolling here, get caught up with the other questions that came in before the show started. So this one was from B More BZ, and he said, let's talk satellites, pros and cons. It's a good question. I play some satellites, so you can kind of see my contest selection mix here tonight for the main slate, right? And I like to play some of these satellites. I think there's a few things on this. I think what really got me into the satellites overall is that I found that they were overlaying often. I think that's what often gets people into satellites to begin with. These contests, at least occasionally enough for me to want to enter them, don't fill, right? And they're guaranteed prize pool contests, especially if you are hunting for overlay at lock and looking for satellites very close to lock that maybe you can even find some sometimes that are very low. I wonder if there's a slate that's locking. There isn't. The 12 turbo just started, but you can find satellite contests that are lost my train of thought. Sorry. That are very unfilled heading into lock, and they're guarantees prize pools contests. You can play contests that are like 16, 20 people out of 47. That there's a single ticket up top, and you end up finding that you're just beating out 15 other people to win that ticket. I think overlay can be a really good reason to play them. I also, I mean, you guys can see here, I hammer this under $3 stuff hard. A lot of times it's under $1 stuff on any given slate. I think satellites can be a nice tool as a way to get access to playing some of the bigger dollar contests, if that's exciting to you. It doesn't make a lot of sense for somebody with a maybe average size bankroll to be dropping a bunch of entries into the $10 Thursday Night Millionaire for the NFL kickoff. But by playing satellites here almost every single day in MLB, pretty soft on the bankroll, and it allows me to get some action in that kind of contest, which is fun. I have almost probably close to 50 tickets now for this contest here, which is a lot of value. I would say a few things that maybe are more on the con side of maybe why you might want to avoid satellites. One, you're going to get raked twice. The contest that the satellite you're playing has some rake associated with it, right? They're not playing out the actual value. The ticket at the top or the set of tickets at the top does not add up to the equal value of all the entry fees that they're collecting on that contest. They're raking the satellite, the sites are, and then they're also raking the actual contest itself, right? So again, you get raked twice. You get raked once when you play the satellite, and you get raked again when you play the contest that you won the ticket to. I also, I don't know, coming from someone that does like satellites, I'm trying to think about some kind of other cons here or reasons why you might want to play them. I have an approach to my lineup building strategy. I end up playing, I would say, fairly contrarian on most slates. I take pretty aggressive stands with my leverage plays on highly owned players, satellites in general, because there's just one or a set of tickets up top, and things like that are going to be, you can't really afford to play chalky plays. You'll see here, even if you look at our satellite slider settings, they are often, so you can see the difference between a GPP, even a 150 max 10 to 50K and a satellite. It's going to up the ownership fade and it's going to up the smart diversity, right? So if you are playing, especially if you are used to playing things like, cash for sure, but if you're playing even smaller tournaments like single entries, 3 maxes, things where you're often at least going to be willing to play somewhat chalkier lineups, somewhat less diverse lineups, you may find that it's a big pivot overall to the strategy you need to be successful in satellites, right? You need to take some pretty serious stands with your overall approach to playing satellites. But I think they're nice. Yeah, again, so I would say pros here, they overlay a lot, which is, it beats out the rake, right? At least, and it makes it a very easy contest to win. And it provides an opportunity for people that maybe don't have the bankroll to play really big contests to get some action in those contests. It gives you a little bit of a tool to at least rack up some tickets and try your hand at some stakes that maybe you don't normally play. Cons of the satellites would definitely be being raked twice, and just recognizing that they are a different game type. They are essentially play like very top-heavy GPPs, extremely top-heavy GPPs, and you need to make sure that your approach to playing those contests matches the payout structure that exists in those contests. But I've had some success with them. Just a anecdotal from me playing a lot of like 10 cent and 25 cent satellites, and I will probably continue to play more in the future. I like them. But the other thing too to remember is that, like, you should ask yourself if the reward, if the prize at the top is something that's even attractive to you. Like, you don't need to necessarily play satellites that are for sports that you're maybe less so interested in, but even slates. Like, if you are playing satellites to win a ticket to the Millie Maker for Week 1 NFL, ask yourself if that is a contest. Obviously, yeah, everybody wants a chance at $1 million, so it's an attractive contest in that way. But it's a difficult contest to win anyway, and you should ask yourself if you want to kind of be applying your bankroll in that way to win those tickets. So, but good question. They are a part of my contest selection strategy for my particular approach. So, but great question there. Okay, cool. So a few other questions here. We got a good one two from Laddie here. And he said, does the golf model specifically this week account for how much more valuable final placement being that the top 30 advance next week? It does not. So this is definitely kind of in that, I guess it's a bit of a narrative in a lot of ways. And these narratives in general are something that our model's not really going to pick up on very well. It's difficult to quantify these things. So I would say, this is a very good opportunity to add some value to your own process and to editing projections if you think and you've got a read on how you would go about quantifying that, right? It's not something that I've dug into deeply here so far. I haven't done a lot of my golf prep for the slate so far, but if you're going through and looking at what the implications of certain finish positions are in the tournament for this week as it relates to the tournament next week, and you want to bump up or bump down some guys that you think maybe are going to be, I don't know, playing around that line. These things are difficult to predict, but playing around that line or guys that maybe have a little bit more to play for here, I think it's a great opportunity to do that. In general, our model isn't going to pick up narratives in that way very well. I don't know how much weight I put on that kind of stuff. I think in general, I ultimately take the approach that everybody, for the most part, is going out there to try to win most weeks. But I know that's really not the reality of what's going on in these guys' mind. I think part of that comes from the fact that for me, it is just difficult to quantify what kind of boost certain guys get. There's narratives for everything, right? There's birthday narratives, there's revenge narratives, there's all kinds of reasons why people might think that somebody maybe has an edge or is a better play at the start or before a slate. I think the biggest thing is those things are just very hard to quantify. There's a lot of noise in that. So we are all very data-driven approach here. So in other words, the model is not taking that into account already. But if you've got a read on that and you think you've got an edge there, I would definitely say a good opportunity to make some tweaks to the projections. So I see some follow-up questions that came in here about the satellite thing, so I'm going to jump back. Adam asked, on the satellite debate, there are some where the entries are higher, $3, but can be something like 25 to 100 tickets awarded. Accounting for overlay, these can often turn into double ups of cash. Yeah, I think the satellites in general get better at some higher dollars. I have been very careful with overplaying satellites, and I'm kind of allowing them to be a small portion of my bankroll investment on any given night for now. But I think especially when you are at that line where you're under $3, where you're still not competing against the best players in the lobby, but you're above the very bottom of the 10 cent and the 25, your odds can actually get a lot higher at being able to win a ticket. And you can really seriously start to rack up tickets quickly. NFL best ball is another thing too, where I racked up just a ton of tickets. I've gotten to draft not really for free, but essentially for free. I've gotten to do a ton of NFL best ball drafts. So yeah, it can be a smart investment. I would say it does take, it takes some understanding of contest structures overall, I think, to be able to identify these easier, because they're not always as straightforward as looking at a GPP tournament or something like that and quickly being able to identify whether it's a profitable contest or what kind of lineups you need to build to be profitable in that contest. But cool. All right. Cool. I'm going to keep us rolling here. Jump back to some of these questions that came in here before the start of the stream. This was another one that came in from Laddie, and he said, could you remind me of how you attack boosters? I play these a lot, and how I approach them varies from slate to slate. Top 8 to 10% wins, which is a little more forgiving than a typical satellite, but also not to be treating like you have to beat out 40K others. Yeah, so we talked about this. I think it was either earlier this week or last week. I play a lot of these too. I like these contests quite a bit. The 10x and even sometimes the 40x boosters. I wrap them up into my overall strategy of how I play my GPP lineups. Basically assuming a lot of times the way I'm playing a slate is generally building 150 lineups, right? That's going to end up going into my 150 max contests, and then using like a ranked fill method to play the lineups that are at the top in all of the contests that I'm playing. That's my general approach to contest selection and also filling my lineup. So because of that, not because of that, alongside that, I wrap up those boosters into my overall GPP lineup portfolio. I think that makes sense for what the payout structure of these contests are, even if they are not a tournament style contest structure where it's like a staircase where every next best lineup gets paid out a little bit more. It's a flat payout structure. When you're talking about a contest where it's really only 8 to 10% winning, like you've mentioned here, I think it makes a lot of sense to attack those like a GPP. I think in something like the 40x satellites, you could even justify if you had a different strategy to your satellite lineup construction. If you were building separate builds for your satellites, I think it would make sense to wrap those into your satellite lineup portfolio, because they're very top heavy at the top. 40x is only paying out roughly 1/40th of the field. So what is that, 2.5%? So That's very top heavy, and I think it does make sense to play those aggressively in your upside and ownership standpoint in your builds. So. Okay, cool. But good question. Laddie, don't know if you're watching here along with me today, but let me know if you have any follow-up questions there. Okay, a few questions about some of these research builds here. These are in Slack. I'm going to hit these real quick. I will make sure. I know there are some questions that have come in into YouTube chat, so I will get to everything, I promise. But this question came in from Devin here. And this is about research builds. So he said, question regarding research builds, wouldn't running it at 0-0-10 sliders be more indicative of pitcher optimal chances rather than leaving correlation on? I understand turning correlation up to see optimal stacks. Yeah, I've talked myself more and more into this just in general. First of all, if you have no idea what we're talking about, like research build, what is going on here? This idea originally came here. This is a SaberSim's YouTube page. And this idea originally started and came up in the strategy session I did with Max called How to Find the Right Stacks for MLB DFS. And it's an idea that we've then proceeded to kind of refine and talk about here a bunch on stream. But the idea here is basically running builds that turn ownership off and use single game simulations with smart diversity at 10 to basically approximate a player's chance of being optimal at their position for any given slate, right? If we build 1,500 lineups with sliders that have smart diversity at 10 and are ownership agnostic, we'll talk about correlation in a second because that's what this question is about. The exposures that we get at the end, especially when viewing that full pool of 1,500, are an approximation of what that player's likelihood of being optimal for their position is, because we're using single game simulations. The player that's played at the pitching spots is probably the optimal pitcher for that individual game sim. We do that 1,500 times, we can approximate chance to be optimal. That's the idea here. If you're interested in learning more about that, I would say go back here to this How to Find the Right Stacks for MLB DFS video. I know some of you guys that are regulars here on the stream probably are pretty well familiar with that, but I just want to make sure in case anybody is totally blindsided by that I always explain what's going on here. But anyway, let's talk about this here for Devin. So yeah, I actually have been thinking about this more and more. And I actually am starting to think that it makes sense to run these builds at these settings unless you are very intentionally trying to look at stacks, right? Because yeah, the impact of correlations, pitchers do have very minor correlations with their hitters in the order, right? If the hitters do well, the pitcher's more likely to get the win bonus. That creates a minor correlation that could kind of dirty up your research build if you are trying to look at pitchers overall, right? You might overemphasize pitchers that have strong hitting teams alongside them. So yes, I think the answer to this is if you want to really do a deep dive into pitchers or individual players, just turn your correlation off for your research build. If you want to look at stack data and look at the chance of a certain stack being optimal, keep your correlation up. And that is probably what I would say is the best way to do that. But more and more, I've been finding I'm running my builds closer to this instead. So. And then, okay, so a follow-up question here from Brian that also fits in very well here. And he said, when running a 0-0-0 chalk build, do you think cutting off the 7, 8, 9 batters from any stacks adds some value, as that is more likely what the field is going to do? It can. The thing, though, is that those 7, 8, 9 batters aren't going to be 0% ownership. And I think you might overinflate. I think you actually almost certainly would then overinflate the ownership on the 1 through 6 batters. So the nice thing about doing the build this way, and I should mention too, also, if you're unfamiliar with this idea, this is another similar idea of running a build for research. In this particular case, the build is run at 0-0-0. We often throw a stack rule to say a minimum of 5 or something like that for DraftKings. And the idea here is we're trying to mimic what an average player using a traditional optimizer that only optimizes for average projection and throws a manual stacking rule in there to get some correlation and seeing what kind of lineups that you get out of that, right? This can be a good way of approximating or getting an idea of what the field is going to do on a slate. We've even talked about before on stream here of matching up your team totals to match Vegas to then even get the value of somebody just using a Vegas-based projection model, which is probably 90% of the projection models out there, can be a really good way of getting an idea of what the field is going to do to add on to just looking at something like ownership projections. But I would say I'd probably avoid this because in the average projections, we talked about this too yesterday, but in the average projections, the difference between a player batting at the top of the order is going to be pretty dramatic compared to the projections of the players batting lower in the order. I think you are naturally just going to get less of these lower order batters guys showing up in that build in the way that matches how likely those players are going to be actually owned. But if you manually go in and remove them before you run that build, you're going to essentially assume zero ownership to all of those guys, and that's not what it actually is going to happen. So I'd be a little bit cautious with doing that. If you were playing maybe a single entry contest or a small field contest where you felt like that was actually very indicative of what the field does, that those guys essentially get ownership that is so low it can be approximated as zero, then that's fine. But I think you probably stand to lose more than you stand to gain there by removing those players from your chalk build pool. So, but a good question. Okay, cool. I think I've just gotten about all caught up here on the questions that came in through Slack before the stream started. So we will jump back up here and I will hit some of these questions that came in at the top. So this one was from Kenneth. He said, I always remove all stack types with less than 4 after my build based on the history of the... Okay, actually, I'm sorry. Just because I saw this question, I saw this follow-up coming from Brian, and I want to hit this while I'm still on the topic. So sorry, Kenneth, I will get right back to your question, but he said, I still leave them in the pool, but I don't let them be in the stacks, referring to those bottom of the order guys. I still think that players are likely enough to use them in their stacks that I would leave them in. Again, if you have a read on the contest that you're playing here, and that you think that this is like representative of what you see the lineups kind of look like by the field in your contest, I would say go for it. But it's an interesting idea, right? Because I do think a lot of people build lineups like this, and I think it's a mistake. But I don't think enough people do this that I would want to remove them from all of my stacks, because they are going to show up in those kinds of lineups. I still think you're going to unnaturally depress ownership on those lower batting order guys a little bit. But I haven't experimented with this, to be completely honest. Like, I haven't experimented with doing the chalk build this way. So I would say give it a try, and see what those exposures look like, and see if you feel like they're a little bit more dialed in. The other thing too to note there is that a lot of times these guys that are batting lower in the order will be like min salary guys, really low salary guys that grade out really well on a point per dollar basis. And these guys can actually carry a lot of ownership, right? Because of the way a traditional optimizer is going to build lineups. It's going to pack a bunch. It's going to try to pack as many points as possible in under the given salary cap. So when you look at a guy like Anthony Alford batting 8th for Pittsburgh, a traditional optimizer is going to say, wow, we can get 8.6 points for the price of 2,000 salary. That's great value. Slam him in. And these guys actually end up getting quite a bit of ownership. And a lot of times they're thrown into stacks because they fit in cheaply to stacks. So that is something also to just watch out for there. But awesome. Cool. All right. I'm going to jump back here to Kenneth's question. Sorry, Kenneth. He said, I always remove all stack types with less than 4 after my build based on the history of the winning lineups in the tournament. Is that a smart move? Yeah, I think in general, let's go back. Do I have like a test build here? Let's see, like one that is maybe, where's my 150 max lineup? I know I built 150 earlier. That's the one I want to look at. I don't know where it is. Anyway, let's just run a new test build here and talk about this real quick. I've always said that I should name these builds and do a little bit better job of like naming so I can find the exact ones that I was talking about. But I think you'll find that in general, the correlation is going to give you a lot of these right-sized stacks anyway to begin with, especially for like 20 maxes. I don't even think you're going to get a lot of 3. Biggest size stack in the lineup is a 3 max lineup. But I think it does make some sense to go through and remove those lower sized stacks from your lineup builds, especially in a sport like baseball, where I think we have a really strong case to believe that players just still aren't stacking enough. There's some leverage on that roster construction overall. If you got a lineup that only had a 3-piece stack in your build and you were using something like default settings and it had a high Saber score, the builder is essentially making a statement to you that, yes, even considering how much correlation we want in the lineups, this lineup has enough upside and is well leveraged against the field enough to be profitable in this contest. So you can see these all have at least 4 anyway. But I think if you want to maximize the impact of correlation, I think it's totally fine to chop off some of the smaller size stacks from your lineups. I end up generally doing something similar or setting a manual stacking rule that just says, don't build me lineups that have less than 4. A few things to look out for there. I will say one is this is great on big main slates, but on smaller slates, right? You are probably more likely to get smaller stacks in your builds. The correlation is going to go down. So we can look at, let's look at this 2-game turbo. Correlation is going to go down quite a bit, right? Pretty significantly. You're probably going to get some different sized stacks and some smaller stacks here, just because the chance of one of these 2 teams having such an upside game, such a ceiling game that you need 4 or 5 of those players is lower just because there's only 4 teams playing baseball, right? The chances of any one team having a ceiling outcome are greater the more teams on the slate, which is part of the reason why we want to stack these lineups with large stacks anyway to begin with. So I think that this theory and this idea in general works pretty well for the big slates, but just be a little bit careful doing this on smaller slates where the impact of correlation and the importance of correlation is diminished. But for big slates and things like that, I think that's totally fine. So. Okay, cool. All right, I'm going to keep it rolling. Good question here came in from Chris. Is there any way to always get one of every lineup? So, for example, you want to crunch 300 lineups, but one of each team. How do I go about that? I would recommend a few things. First of all, if you want to be that wide, there's a few different ways to do that, and it depends on how like locked in you are to wanting that. But the very first thing you could do is. And the first thing I would recommend in general is, say you're playing, it's 300 lineups or something like that, is 100% just absolutely just crank up your smart diversity, right? If you want to play a very wide approach overall, you want exposure to almost every single team on the slate, the best thing I can do is recommend cranking up smart diversity. Let's see actually real quick and see what happens if we do that. I'm going to let this run because I'm curious. I think in general, with a smart diversity at max, you are likely to get at least some exposure to every single team on the slate. And if you don't, you can mess with exposures here a little bit to dial that in a little bit more. But let's see what this build does. And if it doesn't give you that exposure that you're looking for, you don't have actual exposure to every single team, there's a few other ways that you can kind of force that along in your build. So I'm going to let this build here for a second. Chris, I see you said that your message is getting deleted. I've got it right here. I've got it. So I don't know why it's getting deleted or if it's not showing up on your end, but we'll talk about this a little bit. So yeah, I want to run this build because I'm curious to see what happens when we do this. But having a max smart diversity, right? It's gonna maximize your diversity. It's gonna use single game sims in 1,500 different individual game sims. It's likely that there are some where almost every single team on the slate is optimal, is the highest scoring team. So we'll run this and get an idea and look at this. So. I know it takes just a bit for these big 150 max builds to run, but I really want to look at all the lineups we have here. So give this just a moment. All right, wrapping up here now. It's good for me to get a moment to catch my breath here too. Sometimes my voice is a little tired talking nonstop on these shows. So let's see. We'll just go ahead and expand this because I know you mentioned 300 lineups. And I'm curious what this looks like. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. We have at least one lineup with every team in it, except for one. There's one team that we don't have a stack of in our first 300, but I'm sure we have other stacks here in the 1500. From here, right, it kind of depends on how flat you really want to be, right? If you have 300 lineups, and let's just assume that every lineup's going to have 2 stacks. So you essentially have 600 stacks to play with overall, and there's 20 teams on the slate. No, that's not right. I guess you could just go ahead and just kind of start flattening out your exposure to these teams by setting maximum exposures here. And you'd want to think about the exact way to maybe do this. But this is probably going to at least get you some more exposure to some of the other teams at the bottom and quickly give you a way, well, maybe not super quickly, but should give you a way to play like a very flat portfolio of lineups. Okay, so it might have been Baltimore was the one team we weren't getting because they just popped up there now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So now we have exposure to every single team on the slate. If you wanted this to be like really dialed in, where like you're playing an equal exposure to almost every single team on the slate, you might at some point reach a point here where it's going to say we don't have actually enough lineups to even do that. Let's just keep doing this here and see what happens. Because eventually it's going to say there's not enough lineups where you can play sub 10 or 10% or less of every single team. Let's just keep doing this. I've never actually run this particular little experiment here, so I'm curious where kind of the break point is, but maybe this will actually work pretty well. It seems like it will. Oh. Let's see. Getting close. And the reason this is working too, like the reason that this method actually kind of works when we're doing this here is it's indicative of how variant baseball is, right? That there's essentially, when we use single game simulations to build 1,500 lineups, we can pull out a set of 300 where we've essentially stacked almost every team equally, right? So, I mean, you could even go in here, and I think at some point you're going to hit a message that says you need to build more lineups. We could even try to do like this. I wonder if this would work. Yeah, that seems to work too. So now we're even setting minimum exposures. At some point, it's going to tell me that I can't do this, right? If I want exactly 10, maybe. Yeah, no, it's still working pretty good. So, I mean, I would say this is probably the easiest way to go about doing this. Baseball is variant enough that at a maximum smart diversity, there's going to be enough lineups that we can pull out of the pool that basically you could play like an extremely flat exposure portfolio. I mean, just be aware that you're essentially at this point, other than for probably your pitchers, you're really kind of diminishing the value of the individual sims themselves and assuming that more or less every single team has an equal chance of being the optimal team on the slate, which isn't necessarily that far off given that we can even do this. But this would probably be the way to do it. And I would definitely recommend, if you're going to do this, just to crank smart diversity all the way to the top right at the start, to make sure that you're playing with a very diverse pool of lineups to work with anyway. So, but I mean, I imagine on most big slates that you're going to be able to get away with doing this pretty well. So, Let me know, Chris, if that gets at what you were really trying to ask here. And yeah, I think I'm pretty glad that this actually kind of worked. I thought it would fire back and tell us a message that we couldn't build lineups this way. I would say if you wanted to have my original plan of what I was going to answer this question, if that failed, if you wanted to have like a very neutral approach to every team on the slate, I would say it probably makes more sense to adjust the team totals to be completely even for every single team. So maybe you adjust every single team to 4.5. Now that is going to adjust your pitchers, and it's going to make your pitchers also very concentrated at their projection, right? Assuming every single team is going to score an equal number of runs is going to make all the pitchers appear very similarly projected. But from my perspective, this approach to setting your stacks and this approach to building your lineups for your stacks is essentially assuming that all the teams have an equal chance of being the best play on the slate anyway, which then it makes sense that you would also have some neutral stance on your pitchers as well. So that is how I would go about doing that. But let me know if that helps or if you have any other questions there. Let's see. James said, how many users on DraftKings are using programming methods from Python? Do you think this can be helpful and add additional value to places on SaberSim anywhere? I'm not asking for a specific number of users using Python, but just asking if it can add additional value. Maybe. I don't know any Python personally. I have some parts of my process, especially for certain sports, for selecting the actual lineups that I end up playing. Sometimes I do some of that in Excel. I do some things with like comparing the chance of my lineup to be optimal versus the chance of that lineup being owned and things like that. I think if there's something that you want to do in your individual process that you want to do off-site or off the app, I would say go for it. I think it's a great idea. I think at the very least, you'll end up with a more kind of nuanced way of thinking about your lineups and your DFS strategy. I don't know any Python. I don't know what percentage of users on DraftKings do, but I am always definitely encouraging people to expand their process, even if some of that takes place outside of the app, to what you think is appropriate. So James said, I do know Python very well. Yeah, then go for it. I think if there are, I don't know. I think if there are applications for that you'd want to apply to your DFS play, I would definitely say go for it. You probably end up optimizing and doing the things that I do in Excel much faster than I would. So Jeff asked, does golf ownership refresh every time you make a new build? It does not update every time you run a build. Golf in general doesn't really change throughout the week very much. So we will run our sims of the tournament somewhat early in the week. I know our projections are up now. We'll run ownership projections alongside that. And then the only thing that I think that could really shift ownership from there, at least within our model, is a scratch or a withdrawal. So if someone withdraws from the slate, it will obviously impact the ownership of the rest of the golfers in the player pool. And then we will rerun ownership. We mentioned also in another strategy session in this one, how to beat PGA DFS for the US Open. I probably shouldn't have titled this way because it's really just a good PGA DFS video. But Max and I talked in this video about how narratives, particularly in golf, can kind of drive ownership and can change ownership quite a bit throughout the week. If you are plugged into that, that's another situation where the model's not going to deal with that very well. It's difficult to quantify what like DFS buzz and looks like, right? Sometimes there's players that just are getting touted by a lot of different touts and DFS content sites, and there's a positive feedback loop that really sometimes people just don't want to be left holding the bag, so they all jump on. If you're finding that there are guys like that we don't have projected very highly, it's probably because that the narratives are kind of outpacing what the data says. And in that case, I think it also makes some sense to adjust your ownership projections. Again, I haven't done a ton of research here on the slate so far. My limited research, I know that Rahm's obviously going to be pretty chalky. I think Bryson's going to be pretty chalky. I think Rory at his price point could be a little, I'm seeing his name pop up a lot. So, but our ownership projections, I think, look pretty good for this week so far. But if you're seeing a guy, I don't know, maybe everybody jumps on Sam Burns or something like that. Definitely a good spot to add some value by just making some light adjustments to the ownership projections. So Okay, real quick, just jumping back to this. Chris said, thanks. Yeah, I usually just divide. So example today, it's 20 teams. So I would set every team exposure at 5%. Yeah, so we were doing 10 in that example. The lower that number gets, the more stress you're going to put on the builder to find the lineups that fit the exposure. So at 5%, I think it probably still would have worked, maximum exposure of 5%. But at some point, you may get a message. You may need to be a little bit flexible with that on a slate-to-slate basis because the builder is going to want to use the best plays. And if you're finding that you're having a really hard time getting a totally flat exposure like that, I would just make the team totals look a little bit closer to one another. So, but... Okay, cool. Good question here from Ship Happens. What are some good build settings to start off with on FanDuel? So we always recommend that users start off with what we call our default settings. So I will pop up the builder here. So when you click new build, you're going to see a window here that says choose your build settings. And we're going to allow you to choose the game style you're playing, the entry limit that any one person can play for lineups in that contest, and how many entrants are in the contest. So maybe you're playing a single entry, right, with 500 people. You're going to see that these sliders are going to change around. And maybe you're playing a 20 max with 25,000 people, right? The sliders are going to change around again. These sliders are determined by running thousands of lineups, every single individual combination of sliders possible, and then comparing the expected value of those lineups, how they actually would have performed in past historical contests that actually ran. So it's a pretty rigorous backtesting approach. And it is why we recommend in general to stick with what we call the default sliders for your builds. Really almost always. I think that's even true for most intermediate and advanced users here, because we know that these are back tested, right? They're backed up with historical data. So I would say as you're getting started, change your entry limit and entrance to match the kind of lineups that the kind of contests that you are building lineups for, and the sliders are going to adjust to give you the right amount of correlation and ownership fade and diversity in your lineups, and go from there. So I think most of the time these settings here at the bottom can also be left alone, unless there's a very specific reason you're adjusting things. We put the minimum and maximum salary, what we think it makes sense for your given sport and slate. Number of lineups is obviously whatever you would want it to be here. Maximum exposure is changing soon here. It is not super intuitive at the moment. It sets a maximum exposure for your entire pool, not the lineups that you've actually selected, but the entire pool of lineups that we're building. I would say for the average player, again, I would probably just leave this at 100 for now, and this is changing in our redesign. And min projection will basically just be a tool to prevent you from getting very low projected players in your lineup. So this is typically pretty low. It avoids a situation where you might have like some guy that comes in and pinch hits in a couple of our sims and has a non-zero projection, or relief pitchers or things like that. But anyway, some more advanced stuff there. I would say in general, you should feel confident and with our default sliders, and I would recommend sticking to the default values when you're just getting started. So. Okay, cool. Ronald asked a question here. He said, with September 1st coming with the roster expansion, are there any modifications we should make to the sliders within the build settings? Do you know something I don't? What happens on September 1st? The roster expansion. I feel like maybe you know something that I don't. But I'm curious what this I feel like I got a little blindsided here. Ronald, let me know what you mean by this roster expansion on September 1st. I feel like you're going to say it and I'm going to facepalm because I'm going to be like, oh yeah, that. But I'm not actually entirely sure what you're referring to. And now I'm a little scared because I'm thinking there's something that I don't know is coming on September 1st that's going to change everything up. But let me know on that one. Okay, cool. Another question from Ship here. Do you take players out of your pool you don't like? This question also, has come up a lot recently here in some form or another. I typically don't, right? Our approach to building lineups is we simulate every single game play by play. And then when we build your lineups, so actually let me stop there real quick. We simulate every single game play by play, and that allows us to get real ranges of outcomes of what a player is likely to do on a given slate. And our projections are actually just an average of every single game outcome we have for a certain player. So you can look at plays that are maybe like good hitting teams that are up against good pitchers like Buehler. You can see like a guy like Tatis isn't going to be projected very well point per dollar. His projection's probably middle of the road, but he is Fernando Tatis. He has high ceiling potential. He has high ceiling potential outcomes in his high range. This is true even of players that don't have as bright and shiny of a name as a guy like Tatis. Maybe we look at a guy, I don't know, like Lamonte Wade Jr., right? His ceiling, his range of outcomes is going to look a little bit different, but there are these games where he's scoring 20 plus points, even though his team isn't projected very highly. He's not projected very highly. When we actually go through and build the lineups, instead of just using average projections, Smart Diversity is going to take random buckets of our game sims and use the projections that those players score in that bucket of game sims as the projections every single time we build every individual lineup. So you get to leverage the real ranges of outcomes of players instead of just doing everything at average projection like a traditional optimizer is going to do. So for that reason, I think this approach will lead you to still playing a lot of the best plays on the slate, but allowing you some exposure to plays that are maybe going overlooked, good hitters batting against good pitchers that maybe an average projection model is not going to give you exposure to, that maybe some players might just exclude from their pool that I still want to at least have the ability to use in my lineups. From there, you can always adjust your exposures to players in the post-build process here, because we're building a much larger pool of lineups than you even ask for. So you can see this build I ran here about 45 minutes ago now. We asked for 9 lineups, but we actually built 225, because that allows me then to make adjustments here at the end without having to build additional lineups. So maybe I want to avoid Snell. We all know how magnificently Snell has managed to blow up on a bunch of slates this year. He's going up against the Dodgers, good hitting team. I don't want to play Snell, so I'm going to set a maximum exposure of 0 here, and he just removes from my pool just like that without having to build additional lineups. So I will remove players sometimes in this way. If there's a certain player that I want to cap exposure or remove from my pool entirely, I'll do that a bit here on step 3 in this phase. But a lot of times I don't find myself removing players from my pool before running my build. So that is how I would answer that question here. James said, what about Wheeler or Woodruff complete chalk tonight? I haven't really dug in deeply yet to this slate. I'm curious. Let's give a quick look at Vegas and see. But I haven't really dug deeply in. I would assume so. Probably more Wheeler than Woodruff. Sometimes I like to do this just to get my head straight. Oh, Buehler's on the slate too. So it could be Buehler. And then value, who's pitching for the A's? Ohtani. Okay, Ohtani will probably be pretty popular tonight too. Or not the A's, the Angels, sorry. Who's pitching for Miami? Or wait. Yeah. Oh, some no-name guy. I think this could be a popular play for value. I think Josiah Gray probably will be pretty popular for value. But yeah, could be pretty spread out at the top end here tonight. I think it's an interesting pitching slate. I think Wheeler, Woodruff, and Buehler will all likely to be pretty popular. I think people maybe will shy away a little bit from the Padres logo there on Buehler, but maybe not. And then I think some brief salary relief on Ray and Ohtani. I think both of those guys will be pretty popular. But I think the pitching ownership is likely to be fairly spread out tonight. So we'll see. But another question here from Ship. When do you move the sliders? Again, I would say as you're just getting familiar, this is not the place to add value to your process. I would probably just recommend, honestly, just sticking with the defaults. They are going to be very good, and they're not going to make a massive change to your build even if they are moved around. The biggest value add I think you can add as you're just getting familiar with the product is running your build on default sliders and even really with the default projections and making adjustments to your player exposures to dial in and get the exact lineups that you're looking for here on step 3. This is probably one of the more powerful parts of our tool in general, and it's going to allow you a ton of control over your lineups, even if you wanted, it's loading. Even if you wanted 20 lineups or something like this with this build, because we've built you such a large pool, you're going to have a ton of control over dialing this in and getting your lineups to look the exact way you want. So I would very strongly recommend until you're really familiar with SaberSim overall and even probably after that to just leave the defaults alone. Because there's not a lot of value to be added here. There's often a common question that we get that's similar to this. That's like, what are the best sliders to use? And the answer is partially there really is none, but if there was, they would be the defaults because they have been tested against thousands of slates and contests that would take like a lifetime for you to recreate at every single slider position. So we've kind of already done the heavy legwork for you of determining what the best sliders to use for your contest is, and they are the defaults. So James said, sometimes I see one person with one single entry in the 20 entry jukebox, for instance. Sounds like a decent approach because that lineup was obviously great. So he was better off just entering that one. Yeah. I mean, there is this idea that, once the lineups are entered, your individual lineups are not really correlated with one another, and a lineup that is profitable is just as good as a lineup that is profitable that's entered as a single bullet into a contest is just as good as a lineup that is equally profitable that is entered along with 19 other lineups in the jukebox. Like, there's nothing wrong with necessarily entering a single bullet. My reason why I don't for almost any contest I play is because the strongest players in any given contest are going to be the ones maxing it out. They're not going to be the ones that are not maxing the contest out. And I don't want to be underweight in the contest overall against the best players on the slate. I don't want to lose 2 players to the most skilled players in the contest because they were able to have a wider range of outcomes accommodated or accounted for in their lineups that they're going at. So, but again, the number of lineups that you're playing in the contest does not affect the expected value of those lineups in the contest. Bad lineups are bad lineups, whether it's 1 bullet or 20. And if you enter 20 bad lineups, you're just going to lose faster. But with that said, because of the way that these contests actually end up working out, that the strongest players are the ones entering the most lineups, I always want to play and fill the entry limit for the contest that I'm choosing to play. If I can't afford to fill a contest that I want to, I drop down in stakes and I play a different contest instead. So Ronald said, thanks for that explanation on the sliders. I was like, why would I ever deviate from the settings based on the contest size and entry type? Yeah, I don't really think you need to. The default values are very good, and I don't necessarily think that you need to make a lot of changes to the sliders. Again, at the start of the show, we were talking about builds that look like this, right? And builds that look like this. That is purely for research, right? Those are tools of using the builder to build us lineups, large numbers of lineups to look at the exposures and to look for plays that might have upside or plays that are going to be chalky and things like that. But these are never the slider settings you would actually use to build your working lineups for the slate. In that case, I typically end up staying pretty close to the defaults. So Chris said, this is amazing. I don't remember what we were talking about here at 12:52 local time for me, but I'm glad that you thought it was here. Okay, yeah, right. Right. I forgot about this. Yeah, with playoffs approaching, the roster size increases. I think this is something that we're going to be able to account for. I would expect that we would. I would be interested to see if we do. I may have to talk to the team about that. Yeah. Okay. So first of all, so you said it just means a lot of guys we have never heard of are playing. Wasn't sure if there's something we should do differently based on these guys playing that have never played before. So we do have a very cool minor league model. So there really isn't a player playing baseball in the MLB at any level, or AAA or anything like that, that we just don't know who that guy is. So we actually keep track of minor league results. We have a model that correctly weights what certain minor league performance looks like, or at least estimates what that player is likely to do in the majors. I actually think if you're interested in learning more about that, I would check out this video here, how SaberSim's MLB model works. Will and Matt worked pretty hard on building that and putting that together. So we're not going to be blindsided by a player that ends up on a major league roster that was playing AAA all year, because we will know who that player is, we'll know what they did in AAA, and we'll know how to correctly change that or tweak that or tweak that player's expectation once he is in the majors, if he finds his way into a starting lineup one night. So we should be prepared for something like that. So definitely recommend checking that out. And thank you for jogging my memory. I knew you, as soon as you said it, I was going to be like, oh yeah, obviously that is what you meant. But good question. And yeah, so we are, and I mean, it even happens with call-ups in the regular season, right? Wander Franco gets called up. We're not starting from scratch, right? We know what he did in the minors all season. We know how to project him now that he's playing in the majors and things like that. So, but all right, cool. Daquan here said, does this process work for NFL also? Let me know if there is a specific process that you are referring to, or something specific that I mentioned here on stream that you are referring to overall. But I would say in general, like the overall processes that are used when you're building lineups with SaberSim are going to be the same, right? We simulate football games play by play in the same way. We have real ranges of outcomes for players based on what we see them do in our variety of game sims. We calculate correlation of certain players dynamically and quantitatively, and can determine exactly how correlated any one player is with other players on his team. Oh, okay. So Daquan said finding leverage and research building. Yes. So I do that exact same thing for football, almost down to basically the exact same details. I do the same approach of running builds on settings like this to get an idea. You can turn correlation up if you want to look at stacks and see what stacks are likely to be optimal. But I think in NFL, it matters a little bit less for your research, right? Because you can look and see what players are likely to be optimal or have greater upside for their ownership. And then later, when you run your build, your correlation is going to be at a value that makes sense, and you're going to get the stacks naturally, right? But yes, my overall approach to how I build my lineups, which is running these research builds to determine upside, running chalk builds to determine who's going to be highly owned, and then finding the leverage that way, is the exact same. And it's honestly true for almost every single sport I play. I do the same thing for golf. I do the same thing for MMA. The only sport that I regularly play that is slightly different is basketball. And we can talk about more basketball here as it is coming up. And I would do it the same way if we didn't have crazy late swapping and everything like that going on all the time. This process just takes some time to do if you've ever gone through and run these builds. And with basketball, I've always said if you can't do your basketball process, apart from just basic research and looking at the slate, but if you can't do your lineup building process for basketball in 10 minutes or less, it probably isn't a good process, because it takes a really long time. Well, not a really long time, but it takes too long to do these research builds and everything like that when news is breaking 5 minutes before lock in basketball. But I do the same approach for football, baseball, golf, MMA. When I dabble in things like NASCAR, esports, things like that, I still do the same thing. So these are DFS concepts. They are not so much sport specific concepts. So a few other questions here. Ship said, how do you find the chalk players? So the easiest way to do that, at least the right starting point, is to look at our ownership projections. We project ownership by basically making an attempt to simulate the contest or simulate the slate, and see what players we think are show up in the greatest percentage of tens of thousands of lineups that we build. And those become our ownership projections. They are very good. I think a few notes here is one, we're not going to pick up on narratives very well. I mentioned that before. So we are going to, if a particular player is getting touted a lot, or if there's a narrative that he's playing against his old team and that's going to make him chalky, or there's a bunch of different narrative reasons why that around the industry a certain player could become more chalky than we project. That's one spot where we might not pick it up very well. The other limitation is that our projection model in some capacity is an input to our own ownership projections. So if we are higher than Vegas and a lot of the other sites on a certain team already, it's possible that we might overproject that player's ownership, right? We may think that the rest of the industry is as high as they are, as we are on them, and overproject their ownership slightly. So we are looking at ways to improve ownership, right? Again, I think our ownership model is very good, but no model is perfect. And we're looking at ways to improve this over time. I think if you are interested in really diving into ownership projections and seeing where you can add more value, one thing I recommend doing is running what I call a chalk build. We talked about that a little bit at the start of the stream. But what a chalk build is it is going to be running a build at 0, settings, right? This is going to mimic a traditional optimizer. This isn't going to do any of the cool stuff that SaberSim does, like correlation and ownership fade and smart diversity. It's going to use average projections to determine just the average, the best lineups possible when optimizing for average projection. And normally I will also set a stack rule. For baseball, I'll set one of like 5 to make sure that we get stacks. So we build lineups that actually look like lineups people are going to play. For football, a lot of times I would just do a very basic stack. I'll do the same overall principles here of a build like this, but I'll set a very basic stack that just says at least 2 players. Match a QB with at least one other player on his team, because I think this is true of what most people are likely to do. If you want to dial things in even further, you can go through here. I know I'm bouncing back and forth between baseball and football quite a bit, but you can actually go in and adjust these team totals to match Vegas precisely and give yourself a way of not only building lineups in the same way that a traditional optimizer is going to do, but essentially build lineups with a very similar set of projections as what a traditional optimizer is going to do. So you could go in here and make these adjustments and adjust teams up or down based on what Vegas has them at, which is what 90% of the projection models that are out there do. Teams like this, right? Arizona's projected at 4.3 runs. We have them at 5.3 at the moment, which when you're actually building lineups, we think is probably an edge. Our model generally tends to beat Vegas closing lines. But players are going to play the Diamondbacks as if they're projected at 4.3, not 5.3 runs. So you can make these adjustments here, dial in your projections a little bit more, and then run the chalk build and get a very good idea, I think, of what the field is likely to do. We're actually talking about maybe even using something resembling this method overall as a way to just improve the ownership projections in general. The only thing that sucks at the moment about doing this is you have to one by one reset each of these, which is pretty tedious. In our upcoming redesign, this is fixed by just a simple button click. You can click a button and reset all team totals to their defaults. So, but that is how I would essentially find the chalk, is first use the ownership projections, right? Our ownership projections are going to be a very good approximation of what the ownership is likely to be on a slate. But second, if you want to even go a little bit deeper, is to run these chalk builds at these 0 settings. And again, I want to stress this too, just because I know there's been a lot of questions about sliders today. This build you would be running here would purely be for research. You wouldn't want to enter these you wouldn't want to enter these lineups. You would purely be looking at what are the lineups that most people are going to play going to look like, right? So you run a build at these settings, maybe you tweak the team totals and go from there. So Daquan said, also, can you create groups and stacks? You can create stacks. I've showed it here a couple times where you can set different stacking rules. You can say at least any number of players from the same team. You can also set rules that control your game stacking, which I think is a little bit more important for something like football. In baseball, you can control the positions that are included in the batting order spots. We don't have player grouping. we think that in general, what player grouping is trying to do is trying to deal with the problem of correlation, right? We know certain players are correlated with each other, positively or negatively correlated. We don't want players that are negatively correlated to show up with each other in the same lineup. We want players that are correlated with each other in the same lineup. We think that our correlation slider is just a much better approach to solving that problem than complicated groups and stacking rules. If you've ever gone through and set groups and stacks for an entire slate for 10 or 15 games, it takes a really long time. We have a correlation slider here that basically tells the builder how much to weight the correlation values that we have determined quantitatively by looking at our sims for each player, right? So you're going to get the kinds of stacks you want already for your teams without setting a stacking rule. We can go back to this build I ran earlier this morning here, or earlier at the start of the show, and see we set no stacking rule for this build. And if we look at our stack types, we're getting a lot of nice looking stacks right out of the gate. Not necessarily all 5-3s, but we don't think that's maybe even the optimal way to play it, that you have nice 5-2 stacks, 4-3, 4-4s, 5-3s, 4-2-2, right? All nice big stacks. So Ronald said, can you all come up with an unselect all button on the stack page since they are selected by default? That is in the redesign. So I'll actually show you because I can. Let me take this down one sec here. And I'll show you because it's cool. So if you haven't seen it already, this is the redesigned app. Again, if you're a SaberSim user, you can use this. You can test it out for us. It's not live yet to everybody, but we're doing a lot of our builds. I know there's a lot of users that are doing their builds on this redesign, and you are welcome to check this out. You can log in at beta.sabersim.com with your existing credentials and check this out. But we will see here on the new stacking tab, add a stack rule. Boom. Remove all, select all. Perfect. I know this is a commonly requested feature. Also, we have these nice logos now here too. So a little bit easier on the eyes to see this quickly. Easier in general, I think, to identify the team logo than it is to identify the acronym, especially when they're all grouped next to each other. So yeah, pretty easy. If you want to only play a couple teams, you can do it like this quickly. If you only want to remove a couple teams, I know this is the same way it works on the current site, but so that is pretty cool. Let's see. Aaron said, forgot to ask yesterday, with a 100-man contest, does chalk players mean anything? At that level of a contest size, ownership isn't really going to have a big impact, right? Like, it's actually really like this, right? And so you can even see, again, sliders back tested against thousands of past line of contests, right? Ownership fade drops to neutral. You still want correlation. You still want stacks. Smart diversity is going to come down quite a bit. We want a little bit of upside and diversity in our lineup, so it's not zero, but it's low. Yeah, at this point, you're basically, I think, playing against people with the goal. And I think, Aaron, I know you were asking questions about NFL yesterday, so maybe this is more of an NFL question. Probably still doesn't change very much. But even for NFL, let's get rid of some of this, go back to defaults. It's going to be a similar deal here, right? You're essentially, I think, in these kinds of contests, more just trying to be right, not so much trying to be different. You know, you're competing against 99 other people. I think you're hoping that your inputs are right compared to everybody else, rather than really feeling like you need to differentiate and find leverage in these kinds of contests as much. So. Another question from Ship here. Should you rebuild your lineups after the batting order is set? Yes. In general, I recommend, if you're playing baseball DFS, to wait to build your final lineups until all the lineup cards are out. So you make sure, first of all, that you're not playing players that are not in the lineup, right? That would be no good. But even apart from that, you just want to have that information in your lineups, right? If a guy that was projected to be hitting leadoff is batting eighth, his projection is going to go down. He might not be as good of a play. That kind of stuff affects everything. So every time a new lineup comes out, we will resim the game. And you can see the last time we've updated. So we just updated 8 minutes ago here. I think a lineup maybe for Minnesota or Boston came out, and we resimmed the game thousands of times, updated all the projections. So you want to wait to do your final builds until all these lineups are out. All of these games have this little green check mark. Now, of course, that doesn't always conveniently work, especially some of these West Coast games don't always have their lineup out by the time lock comes. So if that happens, I recommend starting your lineup building process about 30 minutes to an hour before lock, even if you don't have all the lineups out, and going from there. You can always rerun it one more time if the lineup comes out late, right before lock. And if it does not, we have a very cool late swap tool that is an add-on here to our builder, but it's called the entry editor with late swap. So you can see I have all my entries here. I have some dummy lineups in that I ran earlier. If news broke after lock that I needed to make adjustments to, maybe a lineup came out late and the Dodgers had a totally different lineup than expected, I can actually just go in here. There's a couple different swap methods, but I can run a late swap build and actually rebuild my lineups using the same tools of correlation, ownership fade, and smart diversity and everything as I had earlier or different, and rebuild my lineups around the players that are already locked in to make sure I get the latest up-to-date information. So Daquan said, is there an NFL-only package? There is not, unfortunately, but we do have a free 7-day trial. So you are welcome to come try us if you'd like for week 1. Totally no strings attached. That is completely free. So you can come give us a try here. Maybe if you want to give a shot at baseball as well while you're trying it out, or basketball when it comes out. But we have plans. We have a we call our DFS Starter plan, which is $39.99 a month. That allows you access to pretty much everything you've seen here today, with the only exceptions being on the starter plan. You can't download our projections, and you also can't upload your own. You can still edit any projections you like in the app, but can't download or upload. And you will be restricted to building just 20 lineups at a time on the starter plan. What we call the advanced plan is $69.99 a month, and you get access to download and upload projections and build as many lineups as you want, up to 1,500 at a time. Ship said, do you have office hours every day? Yeah, I do the stream Monday through Friday here at 2 p.m. Eastern. Tomorrow it will be a little bit different. We're having a couple other members from the SaberSim team coming on. We call those strategy sessions. We'll be talking about like a specific concept here tomorrow, as opposed to just kind of open Q&A. Of course, we're always happy to answer any questions, but definitely recommend checking that out. Actually, our goal for that video is to, at a high level, kind of talk about all the things that make SaberSim valuable, all the things that are cool about SaberSim. So we're excited about that here. But most weeks, yes, Monday through Friday here is open Q&A, 2 p.m. Eastern, open Q&A on stream. So definitely hope to see you again. Come join me. Ask any more questions you have. Again, I mentioned free trial for 7 days. If you want to come try it all out, give it a test. No strings attached. You can cancel that at any time. I know we have a lot of people that just want to come check things out. They come in, they sign up for a trial. They set it to automatically cancel at the end of the trial period, just so they don't forget about it, and check it out for 7 days. So let's see. Question from Aaron here. Why in SaberSim, if I want to include more than one player in my player pool, when you click on players, you can only highlight one player from the SaberSim player pool? I'm a little bit confused here. Are you talking about here in step 3? Let me pull up another build. Are you talking about over on this page? Let's see. I'm going to pull this up. It sounds like maybe you're referring to the filtering. So like, for example, you can click this little magnifying glass and filter, and it's going to show you only Ohtani lineups. And then you could filter from there even further for each. Okay, so I think I'm wrong. So for each position, if I want to include more than one player in my player pool, when you click on players, you can only highlight one player from SaberSim player pool for each position. Okay, so if you're doing it here, right, the main reason why is because you can only have, so you're filtering lineups that match that particular filter. So like for catcher, for example, if we wanted to look at Max Stassi lineups it's going to filter, and then it's only going to show you one catcher here because you only have one catcher per lineup, right? So you can only filter by one player position because there's only one player you can use at each position. At pitcher, it'd be different, right? At pitcher, we have two pitchers, so we can filter by Shohei, and then this is going to be your second pitcher in every lineup. So let me know if that kind of helps answer why that is. I feel like there's probably a deeper question here that I'm missing. But for outfield, it would work the differently too. So like we could filter by Upton, but since you play 3 outfielders in every lineup, it's not going to just limit that. You can look at Upton and then you could say, okay, what do my lineups that have Upton and Schwarber look like? Or Martinez, sorry. So. Cool. Aaron, give me a shout if you have any other follow-up questions there that I missed. But I don't have any other questions on my plate here for today's stream. Another great stream, almost 90 minutes here. Thank you for everybody that was here asking questions, being a part of it. These streams just continue to get bigger and better every single day, so that is awesome. As always, if you have questions or you think about questions that you have for me while I'm not on stream, email us, support@sabersim.com. I pick out some of my favorite questions that come in through support every single day here and talk about them on stream. If you're not in our Slack community either, there is a link to join Slack in the description of every past office hours video. It will be in the description of this video shortly here, once it's up on YouTube. You can join Slack and you can ask questions in our office hours channel in Slack. And ask questions. Yeah. Anyway, and I'll pick them up in the next stream. I did see this last comment came in here from Ship. This is my second run on SaberSim. Thanks for the advice, and thank you, Max. It was a pleasure meeting you in Denver. Yeah, I'm actually SaberSim Jordan, not Max. I just realized my name tag isn't up today. I always have a little name tag here. Why is that not there? Yeah, I should have a little name tag here, and it's just not showing up here today. But I'm Jordan. I'm the head coach here at SaberSim. I do most of these streams. So, but Max is around. He'll probably be on stream with us here tomorrow, and I'll let him know you said hi. But we're happy to have you back, and thanks for tuning into the stream here today. So anyway, guys, I'll leave you here until tomorrow. Again, we'll be right back with a strategy session tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. So tune into that. In the meantime, enjoy the slate tonight and take care. See ya.